When I went away, I had merely some slight reputation for being a strange young man keen on cars and racing, but did not seem to have any particular capabilities. My return to Modena after 20 years, in order to transform myself from a racing driver and team organizer into a small industrialist, marked not only the closing of what I might call an almost biological cycle, it also represented an attempt to prove to myself and others that during the 20 years I was with Alfa Romeo, not all my reputation was secondhand and gained by the efforts and skill of other people. The time had come for me to see how far I could get by my own efforts. And what I just read was a quote from Enzo Ferrari, and he explains his move back to Modena, Italy, where he would create his very first racing partnership called Scuderia Ferrari. And I found the quote in an excellent book that I just read called Enzo Ferrari, The Man, the Cars, the Races by Brock Yates. The book was published in 1991, and it's a comprehensive and definitive biography on Enzo from start to finish, and published just a few years after Enzo Ferrari passed away in 1988. I've had the book sitting on my shelf for several years, and I've been looking forward to reading it since the day I bought it, and that day finally arrived, and it was a fascinating read. I love these amazingly well-written books because they pull you in and they walk you down the journey as you read it, and it becomes really clear when the key moment arrives in the story. It's the moment when everything changes, and it's really fun when you're reading and you don't know it's coming. So that's what happened to me with this book. And that was when Enzo created Scuderia Ferrari, what would turn into the oldest and most successful Formula One team in the world. The team that would go on to compete in every single world championship since 1950 would be started by Enzo. And that happens right in the middle of this great book by Brock Yates. So that's why I chose the opening quote by Enzo. It was right after he created Scuderia Ferrari and chose to return to his home in Modena and set up his racing shop there. And he described what that meant to him to return to his hometown as someone substantial. That was really important to Enzo, and it marked a point when he started to create something that would last for the rest of his life. And to this day, his racing team has grown bigger than he probably could have ever imagined. So let's just back up a little bit and look at exactly how Enzo created the racing team that would don his name. We have to go back to the very important meeting for Enzo in the late 1920s. And it wasn't even really a meeting, but it was a conversation over dinner that seemed completely random at the time. But with Enzo, nobody really believed it to be random. He was always working his plan. So let's take a look at the passage from the book by Brock Yates. And this is what he says. As the 1920s slipped away, Enzo Ferrari found himself in a surprisingly pleasant situation. He was established in Modena as well as Bologna, presiding over an Alfa Romeo dealership which he enjoyed exclusivity in the Emilia, Romagna, and Marches regions, all of which were prospering under Mussolini's fascist regime. His career as a racing driver was hardly flourishing, but as a former member of the Alfa Romeo team, albeit a second ranker, he was able to embellish his association with greats like Campari and the late Antonio Ascari to a point where he became a celebrity in the racing enthusiast bars and trattorias along the Via Indipendenza. Ferrari by now had gained confidence in his ability to impress and influence the well-born gentlemen, sportsmen who composed his clientele. They were addicted to fast automobiles, and any association with a man like Ferrari, who had climbed considerably higher up the mountain than they had, and who had access to the latest Alphas, was to be cherished and cultivated. And that was Brock Yates from his book. And now you can see that racing was embraced in Italy like no other country. Even back then, smaller cities had automobile clubs and hill climb races and road rallies. They were passionate about racing. And here's how Brock Yates describes that again in his book. But in Italy, motorsports crossed all social boundaries, rivaling football and cycling in popularity. While its center was in the industrialized north, races like the aforementioned Targa Floria in dirt-poor Sicily or the Coppa Silla, a race run deep in the agrarian toe of Italy, were the subject of national attention. And so Brock Yates continues, while it was a badge of honor for noblemen to race cars, many commoners sat on the starting grid beside them, Ferrari being one, and the immense all-encompassing love of fast automobiles injected a spirit of egalitarianism into motorsports that was unknown in any other aspect of Italian life. And then Brock Yates adds this about Enzo. He says, Ferrari understood this weakness and was able to exploit it to the fullest, not only in terms of increasing sales of Alfa Romeos, but in enhancing his social connections. So Italy's passionate about racing like no other place on earth, with Enzo building his reputation right in the middle of the sport, not specifically as a driver, but as somebody who was connected to the cars and the wealthy clientele who wanted to buy them. So he was on a higher level than just a driver would be. So here's the meeting or the dinner, and the events that started from this dinner would create the greatest racing team of all time. And we need to hear this from Brock Yates again, because he sets it up nicely. He says this, quote, "Ironically, it was the good fortune of another manufacturer that triggered the creation of the racing team, which was to bear Ferrari's name and which would begin his rise to international prominence. Bologna was the home of the Maserati brothers, a family of 5 motoring enthusiasts led by elders Alfieri and Ernesto, whose racing experience dated back to 1907. They had begun building their own racing cars in 1926, and by 1929 had created a 16-cylinder Formula Libre machine by mounting a pair of 8-cylinder engines side by side." And Brock Yates continues, this is the car that the Maserati brothers created. And he says, "The car was a brute to handle, but loaded with power and capable of blinding straight-line speeds. On September 28, 1929, baby-faced Bacconin Borzacchini climbed aboard of the Maserati and drove it along a 10-kilometer straight stretched outside Cremona at an average speed of 154 miles per hour. So there's the Maserati brothers who had been building race cars and breaking speed records. And this was a big deal to everyone in the region. So they celebrated this super fast Maserati car with a dinner. And it's this dinner we've been waiting to talk about. Here's how Brock Yates sets the scene. The achievement was received with such impact that the Bologna Automobile Club threw a massive banquet to honor the driver and the hometown boys who had built the car. Enzo Ferrari, a fixture on the local motorsports scene, was in conspicuous attendance, and whether by coincidence or by plan, the seating arrangements were pivotal to his future. And so here's why the seating arrangements were pivotal to Enzo Ferrari. Like Brock Yates just said, maybe the seating layout was random, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe somebody had a plan before this dinner. But anyway, here's Brock Yates again describing this scene. Flanking him at the dinner table were 2 of the area's most fevered motoring enthusiasts. Alfredo Caniato was a member of a prominent family of textile and hemp merchants from Ferrara. He regularly traveled to Bologna on market days with his older brother Augusto. A few weeks earlier, Alfredo had visited Ferrari's dealership on the Via Montegrappa and purchased, with cash, a new 1.5-liter 6-cylinder Alfa Romeo sports car. Though he had only limited experience racing motorcycles, he chose to enter his new Alfa in this Italian race, and I can't pronounce the name of this race, but he entered it into this Italian race where he finished a surprising 6th overall. Taking 3rd in the same race was a well-born native of Bergamo and longtime resident of Bologna, Mario Tedini. Their high finishes in the long, difficult, open-road event had fired their enthusiasm, and when they arrived at the table on either side of Ferrari, they were open to suggestions about how to further their nascent racing careers. And that was Brock Yates setting the scene, and here's why some people think the seating arrangements might have been planned a little bit in advance. Brock Yates said a few weeks prior, a member of a prominent family, Alfredo, bought a new Alfa Romeo from Enzo's dealership with cash. He entered it in a race and he did really well, and now he's sitting next to Enzo at this dinner. And so let's let Brock Yates continue to explain what happens with this dinner. He says, quote, "Ferrari was a force to be reckoned with in situations like this. He had serious credentials, not only in the racing world, but also in Alfa Romeo's engineering and sales departments. Surely it was he who choreographed their conversation, which had one central theme. With their money and Ferrari's connections and racing expertise, why not pool their talents and form a Scuderia, a racing stable, to jointly advance their objectives in the sport?" And there it is. That's the moment we were talking about. When the stars align and everything comes together, it's luck or fate or whatever you want to call it. A few wealthy businessmen really excited about racing are sitting next to Enzo at a dinner table. And it was almost too easy. It was almost too obvious. With Enzo's connections and experience with racing and their money, why not form a Scuderia? And this is the first time we hear the word Scuderia in the book. And for the remainder of the book, I think the term is used at least once in every paragraph going forward. But it's the Italian word Scuderia. It's translated to stable, as in a stable of horses, or a horse-keeping establishment, which couldn't be a more perfect word for Enzo's racing team, which would soon include race cars that he would attach the prancing horse logo onto the side. The same Ferrari logo is still used today. So the Scuderia, or the stable of race cars, was just a perfect name for what Enzo would set up. It's the same name that's used to this day. Enzo would create Scuderia Ferrari with his associates from this dinner. So let's learn a little more about how Enzo and his partners would set up this Scuderia with Enzo's name attached to it. From Brock Yates, who shares the details of how Enzo created his first Scuderia. This is what he says. The deal would be simple. A limited partnership would be formed in which the shareholders would set up an operation to buy, race, and perhaps someday build high-performance cars. Fueled by wine, their dreams of an all-winning racing team soared as the celebrations swirled around them. Ferrari assured Caniato and Tadini that with his connections at Alfa's Portello headquarters, favorable deals on the best new cars would be forthcoming. Moreover, his ties to the accessory business might afford additional funding from Pirelli tires, Shell Oil, and Bosch ignition systems, among others. Better yet, the stable could, thanks to Ferrari's reputation in the upper echelons of the sport, attract top professional drivers who would compete in races across the continent, bringing added glory and important revenue to the fledgling operation. And that was Brock Yates from his awesome book. And it's amazing to look back at this and how this was such a key moment that would set Enzo up for his passion in life and center it around a racing brand featuring his name. It's almost too perfect to look back at this event. And even back then, racing was a super expensive sport, so they needed to fund the operation. And here's how the group contributed and capitalized the Scuderia. They signed the agreement on November 15th, 1929, with a total of 200,000 lira. That's about $100,000 at this time. Enzo himself put up 50,000 lira. Tadini Caniato brothers put in another 130,000. Alfa Romeo contributed 10,000 lira, and Ferruccio, Testi, and Pirelli tires each added another 5,000 lira. Now, just 1 month before Scuderia Ferrari was created, the stock market crash of 1929 hit America. It was called Black Monday, October 28, 1929. Stocks fell 13% in one day. And that would set off a financial crisis around the world and begin the Great Depression of the early 1930s. So many Italian auto companies were hit hard by the crisis, and some of them were out of business shortly after. But Enzo had a fresh start where he can put his plan and strategy in place to navigate this difficult economic climate that he would be operating in. And I'm sure it helped that the Scuderia was not already with large loans and leveraged operations when this crisis hit. They were just fresh. They were well capitalized from the beginning with an understanding that they had to navigate these rough waters for a while. And now there's another point that Brock Yates makes about Scuderia here. He says that many other wealthy men had started racing teams, but none of them carried the name of just one partner. And Scuderia Ferrari had several financial partners, but chose to use only one man's name, and that was Enzo's. Maybe they like how it sounded. Maybe Enzo insisted on his name only. Whatever the reason, it gave Enzo a huge boost because it was him that was featured. And now everything that Scuderia built from that day forward would be directly linked personally to Enzo. And Brock Yates describes this really well, so I want to read this. Here, this is from his book. He says that the Caniato brothers, rich, proud gentlemen, were willing to subordinate themselves to a commoner like Enzo Ferrari in such a prestigious aspect of the operation is an indication of his critical influence on the success of the organization. A bouquet was tossed to Alfredo Caniato by naming him president of the Scuderia, but he was strictly a subordinate to Ferrari. Moreover, by having his name on the door, as it were, Ferrari was assured that he would be first among equals, no matter what future rifts or splits might sunder the partnership. So looking back now, it's amazing that Enzo was able to pull this off and keep his name and only his name attached to this team. But another way to look at this would be if they didn't succeed and they were not able to execute on the racetrack, it was also Ferrari's name that would be remembered as just another racing team that flamed out. So if they failed, it was also the Ferrari name that would suffer. And this was the Scuderia business plan. It was 3 different areas of revenue to make the business side of racing stay afloat. First, it was from sponsorships. And when we were talking about how Enzo convinced a group of wealthy businessmen to partner with him, but let him use his last name, here's a big reason why. Sponsorships would provide a huge amount of financial support. And Enzo had the connections to get the sponsorships. First, there was Alfa Romeo, who would contribute race cars and parts. Then there was Pirelli tires, Bosch, Momini carburetors, Shell, and Champion spark plugs. All of these sponsorships were from Enzo's personal relationships. And it wouldn't take very long before these sponsorships would generate almost $1 million per year. So Enzo gets to use his name, but I'm sure everyone understood that this was, by far, the most important member that would carry the Scuderia forward. Now, there were 2 other sources of income that the Scuderia focused on initially, and the second source would be to invite other rich racing enthusiasts along to certain races and service their cars. And this is probably where the other partners could contribute besides Enzo by pitching their rich business associates to become members of their racing club. And so Scuderia would prep the cars, maintain them, transport them, and basically all the members would have to do is just show up to the race, jump in the car, and go. So this was another way the Scuderia generated revenue. And the third source of income for the Scuderia was to enter the very best racing pros in major races around Europe. And back in those days, the biggest races offered cash appearance payments just for showing up to the race. So that way the biggest races could attract the best drivers and hopefully attract a lot of spectators and a lot of interest in the race. So now you can start to see how a racing team, or the newly created Scuderia Ferrari, was not just a group of wealthy racing enthusiasts, but it could actually become a profitable business. But now there's just a few pieces of the puzzle that Ferrari needs to put in place. And to make all this work, we can't forget, he still needs the best race cars and well-known race car drivers. Otherwise, the whole thing would have just remained a really expensive hobby for the Scuderia. Well-known drivers were not going to waste their time with your team unless you had the very best cars. And so Enzo convinced Alfa Romeo to let him use their cars for many of the races. But this was tricky because at the time, Alfa Romeo already had their official company-branded racing team that would obviously get the very best cars for the biggest races, like the International Grand Prix races. And so Enzo knew that, but what he wanted was to represent Alfa Romeo's cars in certain races that might not necessarily interest the Alfa Romeo team. And he pitched the idea as a low-cost way to market the Alfa Romeo brand in more races than they were already able to enter. And it worked. Amazingly, they agreed to let Scuderia Ferrari drive Alfa Romeos. And it was really just because of Enzo's 10 plus years of service with the brand that they agreed to partner with him. And now the final piece. They had access to good, fast cars now, but they finally needed a driver that was well known, and preferably one who could actually win races, because that's where the biggest long-term payoff would come, from actually winning the races. So the hunt began for the first driver, and it was Giuseppe Campari, who was a driver for Alfa Romeo nonetheless. And word started to travel that Campari was not happy with the way Alfa Romeo was running their flagship race team. So of course, Enzo met with Campari, had a little chat, and asked him to race for Scuderia Ferrari. And of course, Enzo was able to convince him. Of course he was. Campari joined the team, and he would be driving an Alfa Romeo, but not for Alfa Romeo. He'd be driving for Ferrari. And so in the book, Brock Yates, he goes on to describe Campari a little bit more. And this guy was just a character, and somebody Enzo had already known very well from years before. And Enzo loved to tell stories about Campari, so he was like the obvious choice for Enzo to go after. Campari was a big guy, and maybe he was a little bit overweight. And I guess he was also a part-time opera singer. And he was also a great cook and just a great performer all around. So there's a few funny stories in the book about Campari. He's just a great fit to Scuderia, and now they can begin to collect these important cash appearance payments for entering races because they have somebody that the crowd already knows and cares about watching. And now we come to the big moment in the story that I began the episode with, where Enzo Ferrari had to decide where the headquarters for his Scuderia will be. And there's only one place it would be. It would be in his hometown and where he was born, in the city of Modena. So in the book by Brock Yates, he says it was a, quote, triumphant homecoming. And then Ferrari said later on, he said, my return to Modena was a kind of mental revolt. And so that's where I started the episode. Enzo brings his newly formed Scuderia Ferrari home to Modena, and it's well capitalized. It's loaded up with sponsorships. He's got his wealthy partners out rounding up other rich racing enthusiasts who want to compete as amateurs and pay a fee to do so. He has a trusted partner with Alfa Romeo who will borrow his team the best cars that are available. And he now has a well-known driver who can attract attention and cash payments to enter races. So it's now 1930 and Enzo sets up shop in Modena. And now you can see Enzo going into full-on Enzo mode. The book describes what I'm talking about. It says Enzo sets up his headquarters in Modena with, quote, no doubt an air of grudging satisfaction. Now, another important aspect to Enzo, and what I just called Enzo mode, and I just made that up. I'm not sure if that phrase would really make any sense to you yet, but after reading this book, you clearly know what Enzo mode is. The book describes it a little bit like this. Here's Brock Yates. While he had won several races in Modena, the vendetta was a theme that ran through his life. The notion that no slight would go unforgotten, that no insult would go unpaid, and that honor in such situations transcended all practical need. To his final days, he carried on a love-hate relationship with his native city, always harboring a childish suspicion that for all the accolades heaped upon him by his fellow citizens and his final elevation to the status of a near deity, he was not totally appreciated, and that the lack of attention during his youth had not been atoned for. This same refusal to forget would cause him to patiently wait 50 years, half a century, before he believed Fiat's debt to him, incurred by their refusal to hire him in 1918, was fully repaid. And that was from Brock Yates' book. He's describing a little bit of the personality of Enzo that you understand as you read the full story from start to finish. So this is important, and we're not going to go all the way back through Enzo's entire life right now. We just can't do that. You'll have to read the book for the entire story, and you should read the entire thing. But way back when Enzo was looking for a job after getting out of the service, he walked into Fiat and was turned away for a job. And you need to remember, what Brock Yates said is that Enzo never forgets any slight. He's a little bit like our main man, Ty Cobb. I did an episode of Ty Cobb not too long ago, and there's some similarities there between Enzo and Ty Cobb that I was reminded of. But Enzo's the same way. He never forgets any slight. And so part of him coming back to Modena with his own racing team is to show everyone that he doesn't need that job from Fiat anymore. He's got his own racing team now. And Brock Yates goes on about this dynamic in his book. And that's why I chose the opening quote to read. Out of all the hundreds of great passages in the book, it's Enzo explaining that when he left Modena, he was a nobody. He said in the quote, he might have just had a slight reputation as a strange young man keen on cars and racing, is what he was saying. But now he's back to prove a lot of things. It's so funny because he already had a 20-year, very successful career running a dealership for Alfa Romeo. But he said he needed to prove his success was not because of the skill of others. And then he goes on to say, and this is the line that really hit me, and this is why I chose the opening quote. He says, the time had come for me to see how far I could get by my own efforts. It's an epic quote. I just love that. And when you read the entire book by Brock Yates and you're reading this build up to this point and you're following along with Enzo's young life, and then he creates his own racing team and how he puts the pieces together and assembles it and puts his own name on it. Then he moves back to his hometown in Modena and he has this chip on his shoulder, and you're reading all of this, and then he drops that line. The time had come for me to see how far I could get by my own efforts. So I was really enjoying the book and really locked into the book. Like sometimes you're just able to zone out everything and just get really dialed into a book, and everything else just kind of goes away. And that's how I was with this book. It was so cool. And when I read that line, the hairs on my arm stood up. It was awesome. And this is how I knew that was the opening excerpt for this episode. And it doesn't always happen like that, but sometimes that defining moment, it just leaps off the page. So anyways, let's keep moving on. So we're not going to go step by step through the beginning years of Scuderia Ferrari, even though they're really fascinating to read through. There's just way too much that happens. But so I can summarize it by saying this: it's racing. It's just race after race after race. Enzo has his own racing team. Now he spends the rest of his life trying to win every single race his team enters. And there's one amazing story after the other of the difficulty of trying to perfect the race car to go the fastest than any other, and then trying to motivate the best drivers to join his team, and then work harder than they have ever worked before to try to win these races. And so it's just story after story. And so that's what you need to understand, is Enzo's life is racing and how to win races, how to make Scuderia Ferrari the greatest racing team in the world. And obviously he did it. And when you have the best racing team in the world, then everyone wants to buy the cars you build. The wins on the racetrack sell the cars to wealthy people who want to buy the best. And so it's just racing and racing and more racing all through the 1930s for Ferrari. But I wanted to read this amazing passage here from Brock Yates in his book. And his writing is so incredible. It's really incredible. The book gives a great description of Enzo. And here's what I called Enzo mode earlier. This is what I was trying to get at. Here's Brock Yates describing Enzo running his Scuderia Ferrari. Quote, "The persona of the man who was running the operation was beginning to take shape that would remain consistent throughout his life. While still only in his mid-30s, Ferrari was firmly in control of the operation and given to fits of temper that would descend on the place like summer thunderstorms. A misplaced cigarette, a badly fabricated part, or the late arrival of a worker would send his temper soaring and strong men scurrying for cover. At the same time, he could be a model of decorum, transforming himself into a charming maitre d' when the moment demanded it, as when a high-born noble or fascist official arrived at the Scuderia, or a wealthy customer expressed interest in spending extra for the special-bodied Alpha. Ferrari was learning the art of manipulation with his drivers as well. How the subtle suggestion, the offhand remark, the critically timed slight might make a man drive all the harder. Enzo Ferrari was on his way to becoming the consummate manager of men, not docile, soft-willed men, but proud, fiercely competitive, egocentric men whose livelihood, if not their very reason for living, depended on this most demanding and unforgiving of sports. If any man had understood the dimensions of that unique human weakness the Greeks called hubris, it was Ferrari." Unbelievable writing by Brock Yates. And the entire book is like that, just a treat to read and really get a feel for the life of Enzo and the passion and drive he had, and the skill to manage so many egos, like puppets on a string, I think is like one way that he described it in one part of the book. Anyway, so as we go through the years and all the races of the 1930s, there's success, but there's also losses and failure and lots of frustration. And there's also crashes and, unfortunately, lots of death as well. Racing was so much more dangerous back then. It was brutal. Crashes and death and cars going into crowds of spectators. It was a brutal sport where they just didn't have the safety measures in place at all. Speeds of the cars were increasing. The crowds were getting bigger and getting way too close to the cars. And the pressure on the drivers to win was growing every year. So it's just an awful combination. And the book talks a lot about that also. And Enzo struggles to deal with his drivers getting killed, and he sort of develops this detachment from the drivers. Just emotionally, he becomes more and more detached over the years, just because he would end up losing so many drivers when they would crash. Now we get to 1939, and Scuderia had 3 of their drivers killed that year in crashes. They lost another one of their best drivers to Maserati, who lured him away. And now you have Hitler and Germany shaking up everything in Europe, even the racing scene. Germany would fund a huge R&D program for their international Grand Prix racing to build the best cars. They wanted to make a statement of supremacy, even in racing. And that was bad news for the Italian racing companies to see Germany go all in on racing. And then then in that same year, Enzo's fired from Alfa Romeo in 1939. Remember, this entire time since he started Scuderia Ferrari, he was doing it as a partner with, or should I say, he was doing it for Alfa Romeo. Technically, Scuderia Ferrari was Alfa Romeo's racing team this entire time, but not anymore. There was a falling out and Enzo was gone. So of course, look back in history at anyone who did anything important, and if they were ever fired, it was usually a turning point in their life that propelled them to new heights. And this wasn't any different, because now without being tied to another auto manufacturer, Enzo could now focus on building his own cars for racing and to sell as road cars. So in late 1939, Enzo started his own company called Auto Avio Costruzioni, and would quickly create the Tipo 815, and some like to call this the first Ferrari. So there were only two built, which one was scrapped over the years. So there's only one Tipo 815 that remains to this day. And it's in Italy somewhere as part of somebody's really, really amazingly nice car collection. And so now you would think it's clear sailing for Enzo Ferrari. He's got his own company set up and he just built two cars under his own name. So he's off and running, right? Well, there's one big problem for Enzo, and it's a problem for almost everyone else in the entire world too. At this time, Italy would enter the war, and World War II was about to hit all over Europe. And the book says it like this: the 815s had shown good speed and potential, but the entry of Italy into the war was less than 2 months away, and the plans Massimino had created to update and improve the design were to be canceled by the fighting. And so this could be a whole nother episode in itself almost. It's World War II, and it puts racing on hold along with almost everything else and totally changes life at this point. So Enzo's just trying to survive and trying to navigate his way through this crazy time. And it would go on for years. So by 1945, Enzo has a lot on his plate, to say the least. He's been through this war for 5 years now. Maserati finally convinces Massimino, his top engineer, to leave Ferrari. American forces are bombing his factory at Maranello because he still has a machine shop up and running. So of course, a machine shop is going to be a target in a war. His girlfriend was pregnant with his second son. And don't forget, Enzo was still married, and his first son, Dino, was 12 years old, and he was really, really sick at the time. And so Brock Yates in his book describes this period for Enzo as the war pounded down around him. Enzo Ferrari, for the first time since those bleak days in 1918, began to sense defeat. Anarchy, brutality, and death were everywhere in the shell-pocked cities. On his once serene Pandana plain, in the now bloodied Apennines above him, even in his own household, peace was slowly coming to the country, but would it be any better than the ravages of war? It's difficult right now, 1945, and a lot going on for Enzo personally. His second son, Piero, was born with his girlfriend in 1945, and his first son, Dino, would pass away. Mussolini was captured 1945. The war is coming to an end, and now reconstruction lay ahead for Italy, which could be a positive for somebody who owns a machine shop and in the machine shop business, but there's so much work to be done now to get back on track. But still, Enzo might seem down at this point, but he's in no way out of it, and the book has a great line here, and I want to read it. Brock Yates says it best, quote, "For Enzo Ferrari, 1945 was to mark a beginning, not an end." And so the book continues on to give you an idea of what is to come for Enzo. The idea of backing down, of slipping into the gray obscurity of the Modenese gentry, probably never entered his mind. The arrival of peace brought a welcome respite to his countrymen, but for him it was a call to arms. Motor racing would soon resume, and he meant to be a part of it. This time not as the stalking horse of Alfa Romeo, or the contract builder for rich sportsmen, but as the manufacturer of his own automobiles. There has been some debate over when and how Ferrari chose to discontinue the machine tool business and begin the production of automobiles. But according to Cortese and Colombo's recollections, it seems clear that the shift was evolutionary, a slow transition that spanned perhaps 5 years. And so Brock Yates, he continues with this from his book. His reason for returning to the automobile business was simple. It was all he really knew. The machine tools had been transitional. merely stopgaps for the duration of the war, but his reputation, his contacts, his passion centered on cars, and there was no logical reason that this would not be his area of concentration once the fighting stopped. The brief fling with Franchini had only reinforced his resolve to build automobiles in a factory that now had expanded to 40,000 square feet, or about 4 times the size of the old Scuderia. He still lacked a foundry, but otherwise his equipment was sufficiently broad-based to begin the arduous and complex task of creating an automobile from the ground up. But where to begin? And there you have it. That's Brock Yates and his book. You can clearly see now a path for Enzo and how he worked another 50 years to create the Ferrari brand. The racing, the cars, the name, the personality, and everything that comes along with his larger-than-life persona. Of course, he would soon begin to build his own cars, and it was just a few years later, in 1948, when this guy, Chinetti, approached Enzo and asked him to build cars for him so he could sell them in America. And that's what they did. Chinetti set up a small shop in New York City and sells Ferraris, and that would continue for the rest of Enzo's life. But his passion was the races and winning races, because he knew if Scuderia Ferrari was the best racing team, then the cars would sell. It was that simple, and that's exactly what he did. But it wasn't without extreme challenges, and that's why you need to find a copy of this book by Brock Yates. If you like cars and if you like racing and history, this is the book you need to read. There was also a movie based on this book, and I watched it after I read the book, and it doesn't even come close to being as enjoyable. In fact, I wouldn't even recommend the movie at all. They could have done a better job with the movie. So get the book. It covers the entire life, the entire fascinating life of Enzo Ferrari. Anyways, I love cars and the amazing history of cars, and I thought I knew a little bit about Formula One as well because I love racing, but I didn't know the story of how Enzo created Scuderia Ferrari, and so I knew I had to tell this story because it's such a huge part of racing and the entire automotive history, and I had a blast learning all about it, so I hope you did too. After this, I hope you check out a few of my other episodes on cars. I did an episode on Carl Benz and his story to create an engine for his Benz patent motor wagon. And that was not a racing story. It was an inventor's story of perseverance about an engine and how to combine a 4-stroke engine with a horseless carriage and then sell that invention to the public as a motor car and what would become Mercedes-Benz eventually. And so that was a blast to do that episode. And then I've also done an episode on Horacio Pagani and the story of how he created the very first Pagani, the Zonda C12. And that was not a racing story either. That was more of a creator's story about a passion to combine this art and science to produce one of the most groundbreaking hypercars of all time by using ultra-light carbon fiber and a super powerful AMG V12 engine and cars shaped like works of art that you could display in a museum. The Pagani story did include one of the greatest race car drivers of all time, Juan Manuel Fangio. And the legendary Fangio, he also makes an appearance in the Brock Yates book as well. He would drive for Enzo Ferrari for a short time. And so Fangio makes another appearance. But Fangio was so crucial in the life of Horacio Pagani, even though the Pagani story was not a racing story. But I had just as much fun with this Enzo episode as I did with the Carl Benz and the Horacio Pagani episodes. 3 absolute legends. And so one of my favorite things about reading a book that has been sitting on my bookshelf unread for so long is that I start to build up this anticipation in my mind when I look at it. And then I start to have like these ideas of what's inside the book. And I start to believe I actually know what's inside the book before I even read it, just because of the subject. So I was like, oh yeah, it's Enzo Ferrari. I know all about his life. Sure. Like everybody knows about Ferrari. And then finally, once I get a chance to read the book, of course, I see how far off I was to what is actually in the book, and page after page of every detail and twist and turn. And it's just why there's no substitute to reading a great book like this, in my opinion. So Enzo's life was one race after the other, and the goal to compete on the road and track was the force that kept Enzo going his entire life. And just like in a few previous episodes I've done, like the Horacio Pagani episode and the Carl Benz, there's a very distinct time. It's that moment when the stars align, or some people describe it as it's like that lucky break. It's luck when preparation meets opportunity. There's an event that can be traced back. And that's what I really loved about reading this book. It's learning about those moments and the story that was totally new to me. Or as sometimes I find out, it's just when I read a sentence and the hairs on my arm stand up. And I've had that happen a few times, and it's really cool. And I'm hoping you have some of those moments too, while we explore the journey of the world's greatest creators. So have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to carve out a few minutes of relaxing time for yourself so you can learn more.